Welcome to Through the Portal, a podcast from the Social Justice Portal Project, a national collaborative think tank hosted by the Social Justice Initiative at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Shout out UIC.
Each month, grassroots activists and radical scholars will give voice to community struggles, national strategies, and sustainable alternatives for the future. The guest speakers, who are also Portal Project participants, explore what it means to walk through the portal of the current moment by centering racial and social justice issues.
And we're your co-hosts. I'm Damon.
And I'm Teresa.
And today's guest is the phenomenal Kennedy Bartley, a brilliant organizer and strategist who has worked the last few years with United Working Families, a local political party that is building grassroots power. We talk about some of the mechanics and efforts of addressing city budgets through the Defund CPD campaign. We also talk about what progressive taxation, as well as just participatory democracy, looks like at a local level. This is obviously a very Chicago-centric episode and conversation, but I do think the power dynamics and the mechanics and strategies and tactics that are discussed definitely are parallel in the other large metropolitan cities in the U.S. and also made a parallel between Chile and some things that are happening in the global South. So for folks outside of Chicago, we love you. We wish you were here, but we think that you could still definitely plug into this wonderful conversation with Kennedy.
So let's go through the portal.
Let's do it.
Coming through the portal, coming through the portal, coming through the portal.
We are back entering into the portal, and we have a very, very special guest, not only because they are acclaimed and experienced in this, work of transformative movement and grassroots politics, but also because they are my friend and homie and somebody that I deeply admire. So we are going to have fun with this one in the portal with Kennedy Bartley. Welcome, brah, brah, brah. Hey, Kennedy.
Beep, beep, beep. Hey,
So as always, we're rooted in tradition here. So I want to start with a two-part question, and it's centered around time. And, we are in this portal, and, the kind of the prompt of this project is these last 2 years of pandemic and other seismic shifts in our world have been like a portal. And so in this time when you're in the portal, how has the world been treating you, and how are you treating the world, Kennedy Bartley?
Yeah, the pandemic time is I'm like, you're not real. This is not, this is not time how I knew it before. But I think it's interesting, we're, I guess, 2 years into the pandemic, because last year felt like a period of just deep grief, deep joy, deep learning and growing and unlearning, and a lot of deep and intentional work. And I feel like this year is kind of the expression or the culmination of all of last year. I have just recently been reflecting on and integrating a practice of gratitude in the mornings as I reflect on all of the joy and love and I don't know, just feeling wanted and affirmed that this year has brought to me, and just feeling deeply grateful and overwhelmed by that love. And I think a lot of that comes from I hope what I give to the world. So I would say the world is treating me as well as I'm treating it, and my people are treating me as well as I'm treating them. And that feels really beautiful. And yeah, I am just blessed and highly favored, really. And yeah,
I love to hear that balance. So let's set the table a little bit for our listeners and just kind of, start with the context. In this conversation, we want to center local grassroots organizing, what, power and radical power looks like, at the more local level. We've gone really big. And before we get all deep and all into the concepts and the words and the stories, can you just kind of give us the context of your understanding of that language of local grassroots organizing, and what are the spaces that have, informed your understanding of that language?
So how I'm defining local grassroots organizing, I actually had like a really interesting conversation with a group of folks last night, and we were talking about like how are we defining the quote unquote movement. And I think at least like in the last 3 years, I have been like situated in a way that I think is like really unique because I'm like kind of at the nexus of, like labor, elected officials, and then folks who exist outside of those spaces. And I think that like the folks that up until, my being situated here, I would define as like movement. And now I think that like when I think about local grassroots organizing within the context of movement, I think about them in like less distinct terms, like less like dichotomies. And I think that like I am recognizing that like labor is not a monolith, right? And like electeds aren't monoliths and all of those things. And so I think the local grassroots organizing are the folks who like embrace and recognize like the necessity that like this work be like bottom up and like recognize the parity between, sweat equity and like money, and like the folks who are like committed to being radical, right? Like actually getting at the root of these things. And I think, I have the point of view of, again, like, and I think it's a unique one, kind of like feeling accountable to these various groups who all have their own sets of like quote unquote constituencies or folks that they're accountable to. And then like by proxy, adopting those like people as well. But yeah, that's how I think about it. Like folks who are on the ground. And now I think it also involves folks who have like institutional power, but like who leverage it in a particular way.
And you have a lot of passion, Kennedy, and which is an important piece of being able to do this kind of work. What is it that really drives you, that motivates you to do some of the work that you're doing?
I think love is like at the center of like why I do like most everything. It is very difficult for me to make distinctions between like the work and like the personal, and so it feels like just deeply personal. It does in ways, I think, like for the beginning parts of like my organizing life, it felt like, I would be like, this is for self-preservation. Yeah. But it like goes beyond that, right? Like it's like beyond survival, and that forces me to like think about this beyond like self-preservation or the preservation of like, my folks. And so I do think that like love is always that thing. And like the love that I have for a particular group of folks, for people, period, but like for a particular set of folks, that, yeah, too long didn't read love for sure is the driver.
That's beautiful. And I've seen that love in action. So if my memory serves, we've known each other for years. If my memory serves me correctly, you were either a part of or tangential to like BYP 100 as the Chicago chapter was kind of blowing up, but we really connected and got deeper in this, radical partnership in Uprising in 2020, particularly in building out and creating strategy around the Defund CPD campaign. So I kind of want to connect the dots from, the mechanics of local power that we want to cover in this episode to our first episode of abolition, because, not only did I see you function in like our campaign committees or, in part of the steering committee and building strategy, I also saw you leading and operating this citywide table that brought together, young abolitionists who most of our organizing have usually been theoretical or, I'm not saying this word in the pejorative sense, but like performative, direct action heavy outside of the institutional space. But as the portal opened of 2020 and the conversation around city budgets was shifting and changing, there was a much greater participation in like the budget of Chicago and sitting at the table with labor and, different like IPOs and even alder folks. And so I want to kind of go back to that time. Could you explain this table that I'm talking about, and what were some of the initial learnings that were a shift or that were unique in that time that I think probably resonates with many other cities and other spaces about how local organizing is expanding and becoming more dynamic?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I feel like anytime folks bring up the budget, my eyes light up, and at the same time, like get low, because it just feels like, that multi-year project, like was my baby and like the baby of a few like really key folks. And it was like also deeply exhausting and like very, very hard. The demands that are like popular demands and like the institutional or instrumental demands that are kind of like paired with like material expressions of our demands, like via legislation. And so the only way to really do that is to like bring electeds, you know, community folks, abolitionists, labor to a table. And then, you know, in 2020, that was like kind of the second iteration of that coalition. And yeah, I think that it was like really wonderful because it was like the time where you saw this mass embrace and like buy-in to the idea that like incorporating legislative and electoral strategies into our movement spaces, abolitionist spaces, like are strategic contestations for spaces that like we were like never supposed to even think about, you know. And it's like when you think about, you know, the arc of a campaign, right? Like you're naming your targets, you're naming like, you know, how you're planning to escalate, and like why wouldn't escalation culminate around like the easiest entryway into, you know, all of the funding that we know that we need, right? And so the budget is like a beautiful place where we get to like make demands that have like material impacts, you know. And so yeah, that's that space. And it was really wonderful for Defund CPD to be in that space, you know, and kind of like in many ways to serve as the left flank of that coalition and kind of create a space where like when we're talking about red lines, like when we're talking about what is required for us movement folks to give movement elected like the go ahead to vote, we need to be talking about defund. Like if defund isn't on the list, then like, no, you know what I mean? And I think like in years past that myself and like a couple of other people were like, yo, this is like a bare minimum. And it was very difficult to like both make and win those political arguments. And we made them anyways. And I will say that all 9 of the alders that I engaged with did all vote no on that first budget. The second year was a little different though.
I want to slow that down a little bit. I just want to, for folks who may not be in the context, like when you say red lines or you say vote no, can you give like the context of what that no vote is, what you mean by red line, and like what the actual demand was and why that was so unique to a space that is talking about budgetary votes?
Yeah. Thank you for slowing me down too. So like when I say red lines, that means like unless we have this set of things, we are not moving forward, right? So if we're talking about the budget, the time when like every city department gets funded or defunded, right? Like this is the time where we make demands where we say like tax the rich, invest in communities, and defund the police. Like that has been the constant in the last 3 years of us engaging in the budget in this way. You know, if we say, for an example, our red lines this year is if there are any increases to the police budget, if there are no progressive revenue options, if there is like minimal, you know, investment into Office of Violence Prevention, you know, like then we will vote no. And so city council, the 50 people right across our 50 wards who are elected to represent us, they are the ones that vote on the mayor's budget. And folks say it over and over because it's true. Like budgets are moral documents, right? Like this is where you get the opportunity to put your priorities on paper. And so what we say is like, these are the things that we need to see in this budget or don't need to see in this budget for us movement to motivate in favor of like a yes vote or a no vote. And so that first year, it feels weird to be like when I first built that but like when we first built that coalition, there was an increase to the police budget. All of the progressive revenue that we introduced, right? Meaning that we wrote the legislation to tax the rich, all of that we introduced, none of it came through. And there was like abysmal investment in communities. And so we were like, we want y'all to vote no. And all of the quote unquote movement alders did. And so in 2020, which Damon was referencing, it was a bit different. It was in the midst of uprisings. It was at a time where, like, if you weren't talking, right, like defund had created the conditions so that, you know, a part of being a progressive, quote unquote, like a part of the litmus test was like where you stand on defund. And so, that was like an easy and obvious red line. Despite that, though, a set of our alder did end up voting for that budget. And that's where, like, when I say like the budget coalition was both like wonderful and hard, because like when things like that happen, like when you put so much of yourself and so much of movement and like work so hard to like, get folks who historically don't believe in these strategies to be there. And then folks who we got in office, frankly, are like, nah, you know what I mean? Like that is like deeply hard. And it like puts us in this position where we have to figure out what accountability looks like. And I think in our abolitionist spaces and IPOs, all of that, I don't think that we've gotten that figured out. Like we don't have the infrastructure, right? So like every time it's like a case by case basis, we're trying to figure out what accountability looks like. And, now with the introduction of this idea of co-governance, right, with like both movement and electeds co-governing, what I would like amend to call contentious co-governance, that has all been introduced as a result of this budget coalition, which is like a really beautiful and wonderful thing. And I've seen how the infrastructure built in that space can like be like copy and pasted into like other spaces. And for that, I think that like, the movement, the city is like, will forever be like changed and like bettered, I guess, because of that. And at the same time, a lot of contradictions are surfaced, right? Because they've been there, but like they come online. And I don't know that we have the muscle for principled unity. You know what I mean? Like we see contradictions and like we run from like the real political conversations necessary to like synthesize and like make that generative. So, that's what the budget was a big thing. It carried a lot. And I could talk about it all day. So you should, cut me off.
Well, you mentioned in your 3-point platform, the idea of putting more money into community development projects. Can you talk a little bit more about what some of those ideas were and some of your work around community development efforts?
Yeah. And that our vision and that we push for sure. I will say if I left this movement and did nothing else, I think something that I am most proud of is the fact that last budget, 8 budget amendments were written and none of them were written by labor or by elected officials or folks who have this institutional knowledge. Like it was the folks who make up these campaigns and these coalition spaces that wrote the legislation that would amend the mayor's budget to say like, no, actually, this is what we want. And we're not like leaving it up to electeds or leaving it up to like labor leaders. And shout out to the ones who are on our side. But, we are doing this. And so, when you ask like, what are those investments? It's folks from Peace Book writing a budget amendment to make sure that Peace Book, the Peace Book is funded in the budget.
Give us a little drop on what the Peace Book is for folks who might not know.
Shout out to Good Kids Mad City. So the Peace Book explicitly like names a defunding of the police to fund restorative justice in every school, to invest in an office that is like rooted in like not violence and just violence prevention, but violence interruption. And it really is one of the most explicit expressions of like our demands, right? Like the second half of like defund and right. And so, yeah, I think that it is like a comprehensive piece of legislation that kind of like creates the infrastructure for these more transformational, like human-centered responses to various forms of violence and harm and conflict. So shout out to the Peace Book. And again, GKMC for holding that down. A lot of wonderful young people.
So that passed?
No. So it didn't pass, but there is like important continuity and like important steps happening in all of this. You know what I'm saying? And if at another time we can really talk about the budget specifically and the arc and the implications. But I will say that all 8 of those budget amendments. So one that canceled the ShotSpotter contract to invest in the Peace Book, one that struck, all of the CPD vacancies so that we had more revenue to invest in our stuff. One that like got rid of the CPD propaganda machine that is like the 99% increase to their advertising budget, right? All of these wonderful things, creating, more sustainable long-term housing. All 8 of those budget amendments made it into the budget committee. Historically, when we introduce legislation, it gets sent to the rules committee, which is where legislation goes to die. If your stuff gets sent to rules, it's like, damn, bruh, like, you gave it your best, and so it was a really big deal that they like missed the fact that we were like, no, we have legislation to defund the police right now. They sent it to the budget committee, and the implications there, no, it didn't pass. And because it's in the budget committee, because it's been 60 days, whenever we find it strategic, we can call that up to a vote on the floor and make older people say, you're either for the peace book or you're not, right? Like you are either for increasing the police budget for their propaganda machine or you're not. You're either for canceling a contract that is racist and creates more violence or you're not. And so that was kind of some of like the legislative work that we did. And it's hard to talk about the investments without talking about where we get the money from. And it's always CPD.
So you're giving us some technicals here that I really appreciate, because I want to talk about the city as a political landscape. In this series and kind of in our movement thrust, we have these large ideals, these large ideologies, these large platforms, divestment from police and prisons, opposition to corporate power. And I think, many of those things are under the umbrella of participatory democracy. And so until, kind of seeing you work, those things, although important and prevalent for me, were still very abstract. But then seeing the city government infrastructure as a tableau or a canvas to kind of make those demands concrete was really interesting. And I learned a lot from bureaucratic processes in ways that I never expected.
You got really excited, Damon. Admit
I did, because, we have these things of we want to talk about participatory democracy, but until you see the executive power of a mayor and how the legislative cycles go, it makes it clear of like, oh, it's not that we don't have the right ideas, right? Like you named earlier, we actually don't have the infrastructure to hold government accountable. This representative system is not democratic. If most people want, even if they don't believe in complete abolition and change a new world and revolutionary things, we had the budget survey that showed, I forgot the number, was like 87% of people in the city, and not just, our contingency from all over the map, had a desire for redistributive investment from policing into communal services. And then we saw the mechanisms of how that's able to be blocked by executive leadership, particularly our mayor here, Lori Lightfoot. But I want for folks who are listening in other cities, if there are structures to that, we can parallel of like, when we talk about the 21st century and the politics that we want to push, I think you can also bring in your experience. I know you're transitioning out of, but the infrastructure of United Working Families, if you can explain how like that type of space allows us to approach city government as a way to expose the anti-democracy that is happening in our local levels, because we think that like the local is supposed to be more pure, and like Congress is where, these type of heavy-handed, lobby-funded anti-democratic practices happen. So yeah, can you just talk about the city as a political landscape and what our radical futures look like of should this be where we focus more of our energy?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like interesting too, like when you're talking about the framing of, local government being seen as like more pure, and like Congress being like, this like hellscape of like, y'all are never doing anything right or radical, right? Like being in Chicago feels so important, particularly because I can't talk about the Chicago landscape without talking about neoliberalism. And I can't talk about neoliberalism without talking about Chicago, right? And so thinking about, and here's like the global piece that I won't get too into, but thinking about what's happening in like Chile right now, because like neoliberalism was like a global project always, and the fact that like it was a coup led by the US in Chile, and then that led to like neoliberalism as born in Chicago at University of Chicago by Milton Friedman, right, was like tested in Chile. And like now Chile has like the most radical president, and like they are doing some like really dope things. And like you are seeing very like movement focused and centered and led government. So what does that mean, right? Like butterfly effect, like what does that mean about the birthplace of neoliberalism if like one of the first international sites of neoliberalism is now like eradicating that, right? And Chicago, I think, is like deeply, deeply entrenched. I mean, right, like it is like within the fabric of the city. And when I say neoliberalism, that is the practice, the theory, the politic of, you know, austerity. But we have to talk about austerity like from the point of view of its victims, right? So let like textbooks tell it. Austerity is like cuts across the board to all services. But what we see is, you know, cuts to education, cuts to housing, 50 public schools shut down, 6 public mental health centers shut down, increases to police budgets, right? So like, it's not austerity across the board. And that's why we know that it's like a matter of political will. In Chicago, it's really interesting. This is like, we don't even have partisan local races, right? Like, folks don't even say if they're Democrat or Republican, because it's just like a democratic machine,
a democratic
city,
monopoly. Yeah.
You know, but it's really important because now we get to see like the important distinctions between like liberalism, neoliberalism, and like real, like what happens outside of that. I think that UWF is like an important vehicle and infrastructure and space that like should be occupied by our folks to really build infrastructure and like really put in motion like what happens outside of this like democratic machine, this neoliberal machine. Because again, like when I think about, you know, like the way in which like our neighborhoods, particularly like on the west and south sides, but also like up north, right? Like with some of the highest populations of folks experiencing homelessness and some of the highest immigrant and refugee populations, like those things are like manufactured, right? Like these sites are manufactured. The fact that the city felt like they needed to close 50 public schools was manufactured, you know, and that's what we're up against. And I think that UWF names that in a way that is like really important. And I think that if not for the leadership and the staff within UWF, I think that there is like a very necessary naming of like, we are under a neoliberal agenda and order, and we need to do something outside of that. And we rightfully name like, these are like political choices. This isn't because we have to, like, we don't have to increase property taxes. We don't have to shut down anything. Like these are political choices and they're false choices, right? And so I think that there is like a really important naming of the conditions and bringing folks in to be able to articulate that as well. And so that like folks know like when they are choosing right between sending their kids to daycare or paying a bill, like it is a political choice that there isn't like universal childcare, you know, and so folks get to name like the makers of their conditions and then get to do something about it, you know, because there is like this infrastructure for leftist politics in motion that takes up a healthy section. I mean, we are still minority and will probably always be a minority party, but still it takes up a healthy section of the electoral and legislative space. I mean, we just sent somebody to Congress, you know what I mean? And so I think that that stuff matters. And I think it's like, we're here when y'all are ready.
So what I hear you saying, right, is that we don't fully yet have the infrastructure to hold political actors fully accountable, but UWF, United Working Families, is an example of a type of structure where we can functionally mobilize against neoliberalism and, you know, have these space for contestations. Outside of just like the name United Working Families, can you, for folks who've like never heard that language before, you use the word party, like what is it on a technical basis, and does it exist in other spaces outside of Chicago, or are there like sister type of formations that if you're saying this is something to join or really a place where we can activate, can you make it more legible for people?
Yeah. So United Working Families is a proto-political party, right? We are in the midst of building a party. And when I say that, right, like folks are familiar with the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. Boo, right, boo. And so we are building outside of those spaces because recognizing that those spaces aren't like as dichotomous as they want us to believe. And so yeah, it is a place that is democratic. It is membership driven. We are made up of individual members, some folks in labor. We have elected members. We have IPOs, which are independent political organizations that exist in like particular wards or regions in the city. It really is a space where like, if folks are members of UWF, like there is parity across who gets to make political arguments that like really inform the direction of the party and really inform like the agenda and the platform, right? That is then adopted by a set of elected officials who say that they're like bought into this project. It is a project. UWF is a project, and it is a party building project. And I think that it is a place where like a lot of necessary political debate and decision making happens in a way that is like deeply participatory and democratic, and like folks rightfully name like the shortcomings and like the pitfalls and in the room for growth in that space, and then that is embraced because like there are built-in structures for there to be consistent conversations. You know what I'm saying? Like every 2 years there's a convention. Every year there's a party committee retreat. And so like I do think that it is a place that was built by our people and should continue to be contested for by our people. And to the point about like, where is this happening outside? I, in the last year, have talked to a number of different bodies of people that exist similarly to UWF. A lot of them are more formally affiliates of the Working Families Party, which is a national party that functions in a similar way. And yeah, it's just national. So they make national endorsements, and like they have formal affiliates like UWF. We share the name, and like we are in deep partnership in a particular way with them, but aren't like official affiliates. But I've had conversations with, India Walton and the folk up in New York who are a part of like the New York Working Families Party. And, we talk to folks on the West Coast. It's really interesting every time folks kind of say that like Chicago is the model, because we're like, man, like
we love to hear it though.
Yeah, but we love to hear it. We love to hear it. And it's like when you zoom out though, it's like, it's true, like we are doing a lot of things that haven't been done before. And I think it's because we have embraced the fact that we are just like doing one big experiment. And I think that UWF, again, because of its leadership and because of its staff, has made itself nimble enough to embrace that experimentation as well.
On the United Working Families website, there's a lot of personal statement here that you made, sort of again about how you got into this a little bit, seeing how passionate you are, but you also have a lot of hope. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what makes you so hopeful.
To borrow from Mariam Kaba, like hope is a discipline. And I think that like in the same breath, like happiness is a choice, and like joy is a choice. And like, so it is a part of like a daily practice and exercise and like finding reasons to be hopeful. And I think like something that like helps me is like being very clear about the fact that we have not tried everything yet, and so for that reason alone, I am hopeful. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm thinking up new things all the time, and they're much more brilliant. You know what? I said I'm gonna stop doing that. Being like smarter people than me. I'm smart, and other smart and brilliant folks are like dreaming up new possibilities and new ideas and new like experiments all of the time. Until we have exhausted all of that, why not be hopeful?
I love that. I love that. We haven't tried everything. Can you go deep on one of those? Do you have things that you have imagined or that other smart people have discussed or proposed that excite you or give you some of that hope that like, oh, once we get the capacity to try that, that's going to give us so much more information about the world we need to build?
As you said, Damon, I am transitioning out of UWF in the capacity that I've been there. And so I've just been in like this deeply reflective and like zoomed out space. And I'm like thinking about a few years ago, how difficult it was to get buy-in about like this legislative and this electoral stuff, right? Like, first of all, it's wonky. And I was like, yo, I'm an organizer too. Like, I don't think that this stuff is sexy. And I'm an organizer. So I'm like, this is how we've, like, and, we have to finesse and like, you again, contest for all of these spaces that everybody else does. And now defund CPD, stop, 33rd Ward, working families, all have just like come together and turned in 4,000 plus signatures to get a question that is explicitly like a defund related question on the ballot for an election. You know what I'm saying? Like that is an electoral, like the embrace of an electoral process, the occupation of like an electoral process, allowing folks to like say whether or not they believe that the city of Chicago should reopen all the closed mental health clinics to support treatment, not trauma, which would send an EMT and a mental health professional instead of a police officer to mental health crises calls. And like the last however long we hear like Black folks, Latinx folks on the South and West sides don't believe in defund, but it's like those 4,000 signatures say otherwise. Seeing like just an inch of that embrace of these processes makes me hopeful about like what it means when that is like compounded, and there's like more of that.
I want to just pull out something that you just said because that that talking point is something that hasn't been at the front of my mind as much recently, and it just brings up memory for me of. So I mentioned earlier there, in 2020 there was a budget survey, which is like a very mundane, not sexy political thing, but there was massive participation in this budget survey. And it was overwhelmingly in the favor of redistributive investment from police force. The claim we got back, more or less, was that it was disproportionately white, that there was too many white people who were voting on the side of reinvestment and defund, which has never happened in my little young understanding of political history of having too many white people on your side is now being used against you. And it was saying that like, there's not enough Black people, Black and brown folks who support this. So one, I just want to like note that out of like how disingenuous our spaces are, because in any political thrust that aligns with power, having too many white people would never be used as
never heard of that
point. So I just wanted to name that of how absurd and ridiculous and almost comical this system can be. But then we get into these false dichotomies of like disengagement versus electoral politics as being kind of like sheepdogged and like, upholding oppressive power. And what you're describing complicates that and shows that that's not true. And so electoralism, once it is more participatory, what is exciting about it is that it's not just voting red or blue, or in Chicago version, light blue versus navy blue, to pick your representatives to make choices for you, and you get to say yes or no on them every 4 years, that you actually get to vote on legislation or vote on a political agenda directly, feels like that point you're making of there's so much more possibilities. If I could, instead of saying Alderman so-and-so versus Alderman weirdo, like, this is what I want. This is what I want on my block. This is where I want investments to go. That for me, once people understand that as a pathway of what electoral politics can be, I think it can expand our toolbox and our strategy. So I'm just excited about that. So yeah, keep going in on like what this 4,000 signatures taught you and what, more feels possible.
Okay. So it's folks who claim to talk to Black and Latinx folks all the time. And those folks laugh in the face of anyone that says defund. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, I see 3,497 signatures from folk in Washington Park, Woodlawn, Parkway Gardens, some parts of Hyde Park, back in the yards, that say that they actually do believe in this. And so I'm like, either y'all aren't talking to them the way we're talking to them, or y'all aren't talking to them at all. You know what I'm saying? Somebody lying. So, and so just seeing the embrace that we got, in the 20th ward, in the 6th ward, pretty much all Black, and the 20th ward is Black and Latinx. Seeing like the embrace of defund, the embrace of the reopening of the public mental health clinics, to me, that is a mandate saying that the people don't believe in neoliberalism, right? They don't believe in slashing public services like public mental health clinics, and they don't believe in neoliberalism's muscle, the police. You know what I mean? And so I think that gives me so much hope, because I'm like, that is like a drop of the bucket of the amount of Black and Latinx folks who are in the city, And so like, once we scale these projects up, and once we like recognize that this is a proof of concept, right? Now we see that the concept is effective and it's doable and it activates and animates people. Now we like continue to build upon the infrastructure that we built with like the budget coalition, where we brought folks who didn't even know that each other existed to a single space. And like where we got folks like versed in how to write legislation, and we got folks to believe in talking to people to like get them to vote. And you know what I mean? Like what we're doing is we're creating an election for ourselves. What side are you on, my people, on the ballot? You know what I mean? And It's like, it is just like really, really wonderful. And I'm just like, how could I not be hopeful? You know what I'm saying? Because we get to do this whenever we want. And so that's the thing, like about capitalism, right? Like creating its own grave diggers. Like the conditions are so dire that like at this point, like it's not like I want to like, reorder or reorganize, how things are, or I want to like transform. It's like I need to, you know what I'm saying? I have to. And I feel like folks are like in a place where it's like, for folks experiencing homelessness, when they know that like there are almost 4 times as many like vacant properties as there are folks experiencing homelessness, it's like the next time a building goes up, I'm gonna occupy it. You know what I mean? Or like, we see folks like Jeanette Taylor, alderwoman of the 20th ward. It's like the next time they try to close one of my kids' school, I'm gonna go on a hunger strike. Or you see folks who are like, the next time they try to put a coal plant or whatever else in my ward, we're gonna go on a hunger strike. We're gonna like chain ourselves, and then we're gonna vote that person out. They can keep trying to kill us. It breaks my heart to like see these conditions, and like hope is a discipline, and we cannot give in to despair, because like they are going to continue to go harder. We have to respond, but also be on the offensive, because we can't be as reactionary as the right, And I think that like we're getting our stride. So
I'm swimming in this. I'm feeling fed. I want to keep going forever, but as we're being conscious of time and leading into our wind down, I want to talk to like one more dimension of this political sphere that you kind of referenced, but I want to go deeper. So when we've talked about neoliberalism thus far, it's been around austerity cuts and then the over-reliance on militarized policing to maintain control and order, and this push for a deeper availability of public resources. But what you're kind of talking about now is also what it looks like to oppose capitalism. And similar to what I named about abolition, that conversation or discourse is often very big. We can talk about it easily on the global level and like transnational corporations, but usually we focus on DC and their relationship to the corporate lobby. But what I saw and like learned from you a lot is a way that we can actually have a concrete practice in resisting capitalism can also happen in this local level through these efforts of, one, acknowledging how fines is a way that we're balancing our municipal budgets, but also getting deep into this conversation about progressive taxation. And so I just want to like give that to you, similarly to how you talk about those 4,000 signatures around reinvesting from police services. What has your experience of these last few years taught you about how we can oppose wealth inequality and inequity, and how the tax code enshrines the power of capital to dominate our people?
So yeah, I mean, the past 3 years, the past, however long that I've like had an understanding of like cities being run by budgets, like you see that they balance the budget on the back of working class and working poor and unemployed folks. And they do it, like to Damon's point, through fines and fees. In the last budget, the mayor said, now if you're going 6 miles over the speed limit, the speed cameras are going to get you, right? Like they are nickeling and diming folks who barely have nickels and dimes. You know what I mean? And so, man, I don't know, like if folks are familiar with like the shock doctrine, and like Naomi Klein's work, but like kind of this idea that like the right is really good at being ready to move into action during crises, right? Like in the same way that, these rabid capitalists and neoliberals were in, New Orleans after Katrina and like struck quickly enough to make it so that Katrina has all charter schools and no public schools, like
New Orleans.
These folks have like codified, right, like their destruction. And so similarly in Chicago or at the state level, we have a flat tax, meaning that everyone is taxed the same. There isn't like a fair tax where like that is like literally taxing the rich, right? Where folks are taxed commensurate to their income levels. And we saw someone like Ken Griffin, the richest person in Illinois, spent more money to beat the fair tax than he would have had to pay in taxes. These folks have been playing the long game. And anytime at the city level, we're like, okay, well, we want to institute a corporate head tax. We want large corporations to have to pay a tax on every employee that they have because we know that they've got it. Folks are like, nah, that actually runs afoul of the state constitution, and it's similar to the FOP. Every time we want to defund, it's like, that's actually, those dollars to the police are actually contractually obligated. And it's like, okay, word, when can we talk to the person who is in charge of the contracts? And it's like, oh, actually that contract happened behind closed doors and y'all didn't even know what was going on. And also like, not only can y'all not be in the room, older people who y'all are elected also can't be in the room. That is why we have to contest for like these spaces. That's why we need a movement mayor, you know what I'm saying, who is going to let us in the room when they're negotiating with the FOP. That's why we need a movement mayor that's going to go down to Springfield and be like, yo, I'm lobbying for the fair tax because the city of Chicago, home to like the financial district, on LaSalle, like we need to start like taxing all of these trades that are happening. We need to start taxing all of these like multi-million, billion-dollar corporations that are just like here and barely paying anything, right? Like we need to start taxing folks like U Chicago and Northwestern, these like nonprofits that are supposed to like give charity. And we know that they don't, and they don't pay a lick of taxes, right? It's so deeply rooted. And I will say that has bought me into the idea of electoralism as it relates to elected officials as well. We need the fifth floor. That's the mayor's seat. We need 26 alders because us shouting in the streets and getting our asses beat and yada, like that's, like that's not doing anything but like us shouting in the streets and getting our ass. And that's not to say that isn't important, but it's just like folks are like dying. You know what I mean? And like folks are hungry, and like it is very hard to be in the streets when you're hungry. You're right. And yeah. So the taxing the rich and the defunding of the police, we're going to keep doing it. But like we need real like institutional power at the end of the day.
Okay. So that is one, just I got goosebumps. That is inspiring and so well culminated. We have like a closing question that we ask, but I want to account for, you have named it or answered it in so many different ways, but I want to give you kind of one like more generalized summation back to this notion of the portal of our whole society is shifting, and you have discussed so many of the new political opportunities. If folks step into this portal of really taking seriously the mechanics of local power and local governance, what is more possible in our world?
in our world, well, Chicago's the center of the world. let us tell it. So I'll say what's more possible in Chicago.
Do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think like one thing that's like also really exciting me and giving me hope is like labor right now, like this resurgence of like new organizing, right? So like a really like strong and healthy public sector and like labor movement that like make sure that folks don't just have jobs, but they have good jobs, right? With like benefits. And like, I think like what's also possible, like people in North Lawndale don't have to like be sitting on the edge of their seats wondering if their kid's school is going to be shut down. I think that like we have to talk about like ecological disaster and the fact that like if we get this right, we get to do like the just transition thing. Like we get to make sure that like we are creating infrastructure that involves good jobs. It involves like clean water, clean air. We get access to public mental health care, right? We get to address like the root causes of harm and conflict and violence. And I think that folks like are invited into rooms to make decisions that are going to impact them the most, like some more like participatory democracy and budgeting and zoning and all of these things. I think that like if we contest for all spaces, that if we got rid of like patriarchy and homophobia and racism, like if we contested for all of those spaces that would still exist, right? So pretty much a lot of spaces except for the police. I think that like we get to see the expression of like what folks who filled out those petition sheets are saying that they want. We get to like build this world and this city in our image. And it is more of us than it is them, and so yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah,
That's
keep on
beautiful.
keeping on. Yeah.
All right. Any shout outs or anything you want to make sure folks know or are aware of coming out before we get out of here? No pressure. If not, you can just
No. Absolutely. Well, I mean, plenty of love to y'all and to everybody listening. But also, if you live in the 6th, 20th, or 33rd Ward on November 8th, you're going to see a question on your ballot that is asking if the city of Chicago should divest from the police to fund treatment, not trauma. And I do hope that you vote yes. Also, big shouts out to Chicago Torture Justice Center, my new home.
Boom, boom.
Shout out to UWF for building something that is so necessary in the city. Shout out to Defund CPD, 33rd Ward Working Families, Stop, and shout out to y'all. Appreciate y'all for having me.
Yeah, so this is the portal. We have gone through it. I am Damon Williams.
And I'm Teresa Cordova.
And as always, thanks to the Portal Project at SJI and UIC. And of course, thank you to all the listeners for going through the portal with us. Much love to the people. Peace out.